The chill of the twilight wind bit at her exposed skin, a cruel caress that offered no comfort, only the stark reminder of her abandonment. Left to die on her own, the little orphan girl wept, each sob a ragged, desperate sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape of the desolate rail tracks. The crimson sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky with a beauty that mocked her despair, its final rays stretching long, skeletal fingers across the barren earth, as if reaching for her small, trembling form. Her thin dress, once a pale blue, was now caked with dust and grime, a shroud that barely clung to her emaciated frame. Her bare feet, calloused and bruised, pressed into the cold, sharp gravel, each tiny stone a pinprick of pain echoing the deeper ache in her chest. A profound loneliness, vast and crushing as the open plains surrounding her, settled over her like a shroud, suffocating the last vestiges of childhood innocence. The silence was punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic clang of metal on metal. A phantom echo of the very thing that had brought her here and now threatened to leave her utterly alone. She huddled closer to the cold, unforgiving rail, a fragile doll discarded by a careless hand, her small body shaking not just from the biting cold, but from a terror that gnawed at her very core. Every shadow that lengthened seemed to stretch into a monstrous form, every whisper of the wind a hungry growl. Her world had shrunk to this single brutal moment, a sliver of time where hope had withered and died, leaving behind only the acrid taste of fear and the bitter sting of betrayal. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing for an oblivion that would not come, for a warmth that was long gone. The train, a roaring beast of iron and smoke, had carried her family away, leaving her like flotsam on a receding tide, marooned in a world that suddenly felt too large, too harsh, too empty. This was not merely the end of a journey. It was the abrupt, violent cessation of everything she had known, a chasm opening beneath her feet. The distant rumble grew, a tremor through the earth, promising not rescue but an encroaching darkness. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The rumble intensified, no longer a distant echo but a palpable vibration through the very ground beneath her. It was the train's return, the one she had imagined would bring salvation, yet knew with a child's stark certainty would only bring further abandonment or worse. Her small, fragile hope, a flickering ember in the storm, threatened to extinguish entirely. The air grew heavy with the scent of coal smoke and hot steel, a metallic tang that pricked at her nose and made her eyes water. She curled tighter into herself, a desperate attempt to shrink, to disappear, to become invisible to the monstrous machine bearing down on her. The rhythmic chugging became a thunderous roar, and the ground trembled violently, sending shivers through her already numb limbs. It wasn't the same train she knew, but another one, an arbitrary mechanical leviathan that merely existed on these tracks, oblivious to the human wreckage it passed. A blinding beam of light pierced the encroaching gloom, growing steadily larger, brighter, more terrifying, dissecting the darkness and revealing her pitiful silhouette. For a moment, she was frozen, caught like a moth in the headlamp, a deer in the path of an unstoppable force. But then a shadow detached itself from the immense form of the engine, a figure moving with a practiced, almost silent fluidity along the side of the tracks, a dark silhouette against the train's relentless advance. It was a man, large and looming, his form indistinct in the gathering twilight, his presence an unexpected disruption to the linear march of her despair. He wasn't on the train itself, but seemed to materialize from the sparse, dusty brush alongside the rails, a phantom emerging from the desolate landscape. He wore the rough, practical clothes of a laborer, stained with earth and soot, a part of the land itself. His gait was steady, unhurried, even as the colossal engine roared past, a testament to a life lived in dangerous proximity to these iron beasts. He did not immediately notice her, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, a posture of quiet contemplation that seemed strangely out of place amidst the mechanical chaos. The train was a wall of sound and fury, a tempest of wind and grit, but his presence was a stark, almost unsettling calm. This man, a stranger in every sense, became the single point of deviation in the brutal narrative of her abandonment. His arrival felt less like coincidence and more like a cruel twist of fate, for what hope could a single man offer against the vastness of her desolation? The train howled past, a long guttural shriek that tore through the air, leaving behind a vacuum of sound and a swirling vortex of dust. When the cacophony receded, a fragile silence descended, broken only by the man's heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel. He stopped some distance from her, his back to the setting sun, a hulking figure etched against the last fiery embers of the day. He stood motionless for a long moment, a statue carved from shadow and stoicism, his gaze sweeping the now quiet tracks as if searching for something lost, something he alone could perceive in the desolate landscape. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned. His face, shadowed by the brim of his worn hat, was indistinct, but she felt the weight of his gaze upon her, a scrutiny that was neither kind nor cruel, but simply examining. He saw not just a child, but perhaps the grim reality of a world that discarded its weakest with alarming frequency. His silence was profound, filled with unspoken histories and the harsh truths of a life lived on the fringes. She braced herself, expecting a shout, a dismissal, anything but this quiet observation. Her own cries had long since faded to a choked whimper, her throat raw and aching. She watched him, a desperate, animal-like vigilance in her wide, tear-rimmed eyes. This was the moment. This man, this railroad worker, could simply walk away, leaving her to the encroaching night and the inevitable fate that awaited. Yet he did not. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step towards her, then another. The gravel beneath his worn boots sounded like a rhythmic drumbeat in the oppressive silence, each crunch a small, unsettling punctuation mark in the terrifying stillness. She recoiled, a tiny instinctive movement, pressing herself harder against the cold steel of the rail, as if it offered some phantom protection. Her breath hitched in her chest, a painful knot of fear and apprehension. He stopped again, still a few feet away, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but as if to gesture, then lowered it, seemingly unable to find the words. The air between them thrummed with an unspoken tension, a silent negotiation between fear and an unexpected, almost reluctant curiosity. What was it he saw in her, this broken thing, this unwanted remnant? And what, if anything, would he do? He knelt, slowly, his joints creaking with the effort, a sound that seemed abnormally loud in the desolate quiet. Now closer, she could discern the lines etched around his eyes, the deep-set gaze that held a weariness beyond his years. His face, though weathered and rough, carried a somber dignity, a stark contrast to the societal figures who would have simply averted their gaze or offered empty platitudes. He was of this land, rooted in its harsh realities. He smelled of sweat, steel, and a faint, smoky scent that clung to his clothes, a smell of endless journeys and hard labor. His eyes, the color of damp earth, held no pity, only a grim understanding. "Child," he rumbled, his voice low, gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed. It was a voice that rarely spoke, perhaps, one accustomed to the vast silence of the rail lines. The single word hung in the air, weighted with an unspoken question, a heavy inquiry into her plight. She flinched at the sound, unused to such direct address, especially from a man who seemed carved from the very landscape. She offered no reply, only a widening of her eyes, a silent plea for comprehension. Her silence was not defiance, but the mute terror of a creature too stunned to respond, too deeply wounded to articulate her pain. He waited, patiently, his gaze unwavering, and in that waiting there was a strange, unsettling demand. He wasn't asking for her story, not yet, but for her presence, her acknowledgement of his. The vastness of his quietude seemed to press in on her, urging a response. Was he a threat? Or was he something else? Something she couldn't yet name, a flicker of something resembling hope in the encroaching darkness. He shifted slightly, and a faint metallic glint caught her eye. A small, tarnished silver locket peeked from beneath his shirt collar, almost hidden against his rough, sun-darkened skin. It was a detail so personal, so out of place on such a hardened man, that it drew her gaze, a small, intriguing mystery in the midst of her overwhelming despair. The locket offered a momentary diversion, a tiny crack in the wall of her fear, allowing a sliver of curiosity to seep in. He saw her glance, his gaze following hers, and for an instant, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, perhaps a memory, perhaps a regret. Before his expression settled back into its customary stoicism, he cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound. "You alone?" he asked, the question terse, direct, cutting through the vastness of the plains. The question, blunt and unadorned, pierced through the fog of her terror. "You alone?" She could only manage a slow, almost imperceptible nod, her throat too constricted by fear and unshed tears to form words. The truth was a raw wound, unbandaged and exposed. Her family, those fleeting images of warmth and laughter, were gone, dissolved like smoke into the western wind, leaving her behind as nothing more than a forgotten shadow. A flash of memory, sharp and brutal, sliced through her mind. Her mother's frantic eyes, the hurried, whispered command to "Stay here, do not move." The desperation in her father's grip as he pushed her off the train car, just before the doors slammed shut, and the colossal engine lurched forward, leaving her stunned and disbelieving on the tracks. Why? The question echoed, hollow and unanswered. Was it an act of protection, or an act of profound abandonment? She couldn't tell, the lines blurred by the trauma of the moment. The man watched her, his expression unchanged, a stone facade that offered no comfort, no judgment. He seemed to absorb her silence, processing it with the same quiet gravity he afforded the vast landscape around them. His presence, initially a source of terror, began to shift, subtly, imperceptibly. There was no pity in his eyes, but a certain weight, as if he carried burdens akin to her own. He reached into his worn canvas bag, a utilitarian satchel that hung heavily at his side. Her eyes fixated on the movement, expecting a weapon, a threat, anything but what emerged. A tarnished tin canteen and a small wrapped piece of something that smelled faintly of stale bread. He offered them to her without a word, his hand outstretched, palm up, a gesture that was both practical and profoundly unsettling in its quiet generosity. The canteen, dented and scarred, seemed to hold the echoes of countless journeys, the bread a meager offering for a life that knew only scarcity. The simple act, devoid of sentimentality, was a stark contrast to the callous indifference she had experienced. It was not kindness, not pity, but an offering of basic sustenance, a primal acknowledgement of her desperate state. Her stomach, a hollow pit of hunger, roared in protest. Yet she hesitated, her small, dirty hand hovering uncertainly. Was this a trick? A trap? She had learned quickly and brutally that gestures often concealed darker intentions. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows, making his silent figure loom even larger, more enigmatic. The world was still a place of menace, but within that menace a tiny, almost imperceptible fissure had appeared, a sliver of the unknown. He did not press her, simply held the canteen and bread out, his arm steady. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the sparse, dry grasses and the distant, fading echo of the train. It was an invitation without words, a choice without coercion. Her hunger, a gnawing beast within her, eventually overwhelmed her fear. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out, her small fingers brushing against his calloused hand as she took the canteen. It was cool against her burning skin, and the weight of it in her hand was surprisingly substantial, a tangible reality in a world that felt increasingly ephemeral. She lifted it to her lips, the metallic taste of the water a shock, but its cool wetness a soothing balm to her parched throat. She drank, gulping down the water with a desperate thirst, as if it were the only liquid left on earth. He watched her, his expression still unreadable, but a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his stance suggested a subtle relaxation. She broke off a piece of the bread, crumbling and dry, but it was food, and her body, starved for sustenance, responded with a profound, almost painful relief. The act of eating felt like an affirmation, a defiant act against the forces that sought to erase her. As she ate, her gaze fell once more upon the silver locket that peeked from his shirt. This time, she saw it more clearly. It was old, intricately carved, and worn smooth in places by countless touches. It seemed too delicate for his rough hands, too personal for his stoic demeanor. It spoke of a tenderness he did not outwardly possess, a hidden facet of his character. Was it a photograph inside? A lock of hair? A secret he guarded fiercely? The locket became a silent question between them, a symbol of the unknown depths within him. He caught her staring at it. For the briefest moment his eyes, usually so guarded, flickered with something akin to discomfort, or perhaps a fleeting sorrow. He instinctively moved his hand, almost as if to cover it, then stopped, his hand hovering. The gesture was telling, revealing a vulnerable edge beneath his rugged exterior. He cleared his throat again, a deliberate sound meant to break the spell. "My name is Cale," he said, the words gruff but clear, a reluctant offering of identity. It was not a question, not an order, but a statement of who he was, a small anchor thrown into the vast sea of her uncertainty. Kyle. The name settled around them, a new, tentative presence in the desolate silence. Kyle. The name itself felt solid, grounded, like the earth beneath them. It was a name without pretense, fitting for a man forged by the rail lines and the harsh winds of the plains. She didn't respond. Her own name, Ilara, feeling like a fragile whisper she dared not release into the vastness of the unknown. The memories of her family, of a home, of a life before this began to press in with renewed urgency, not as distinct images, but as a suffocating weight of loss. The locket on Cale's chest seemed to pulse with a silent story, a narrative he kept hidden, much like her own. He rose, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of weary muscles and long hours. His gaze swept the horizon again, the last vestiges of twilight fading, giving way to the cold, stark expanse of the moonless night. The stars, countless and indifferent, began to pepper the inky blackness above them. The air grew colder, and a shiver, deeper than before, racked her small frame. "Night comes," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection, a simple observation of an undeniable truth. But in his words, there was a quiet urgency, an unspoken implication of the dangers that lurked after dark. The coyotes, the chill, the profound loneliness. She instinctively clutched the remnants of the bread, her only connection to the world of the living. He turned fully to face her, his silhouette against the faint glow of the western sky. "You can't stay here." It wasn't a question or an offer, but a stark declaration, a blunt assessment of her impossible situation. He was not inviting her, but stating a fact, a logical conclusion in a world that left no room for sentiment. His words hung in the air, weighted with the raw reality of survival. Where else was there to go? The question screamed silently in her mind, but she remained mute, her fear a constant companion. He extended a hand, this time a direct invitation, his large, calloused palm open towards her. It was not a comforting gesture, but a pragmatic one, a silent summons to action. His offer carried the implicit burden of something unknown, a journey into a future as uncertain as the tracks that stretched endlessly before them. She looked at his hand, then at the vast, desolate landscape, the looming darkness. There was no other choice. The irony was not lost on her, even in her young, traumatized mind. The very instrument of her abandonment, the railroad, was now, through this enigmatic man, her only potential salvation. The train that took now, perhaps, offered a path. Her small hand, trembling with a mixture of fear and reluctant resolve, reached out and slipped into his. His grip was firm, unexpectedly gentle for a man whose hands were so rough, a fleeting anchor in the sea of her terror. He pulled her up, not abruptly, but with a steady, reassuring strength. The feeling of his warmth, even through her thin dress, was a strange, unfamiliar comfort. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from fear and cold, but he held her steady, his presence a solid, undeniable force beside her. He didn't speak, simply turned and began to walk away from the tracks towards the faint, dark outline of what looked like a rudimentary camp, a collection of makeshift shelters huddled against a distant rise. The path was uneven, strewn with loose rocks and thorny brush, but he navigated it with an innate familiarity, his steps measured and deliberate. She struggled to keep pace, her bare feet protesting with every step, but she dared not let go of his hand, for it was her only tether to whatever fragile hope now presented itself. The air grew colder still, and the first scattered stars began to prick the inky canvas of the night sky, their distant light offering no warmth, only a cold, indifferent beauty. She stole a glance at him, his profile stark and unyielding against the deepening gloom. He offered no reassurances, no kind words, only the unwavering presence of his hand in hers. This silent communication, however, spoke volumes. It was a promise, unstated but understood, that for this moment she would not be left alone. Yet the question of why lingered, a persistent echo in her mind. What motivated this man, this Cale, to extend such a quiet, almost reluctant generosity? Was it a fleeting sense of duty, a moment of unexpected empathy, or something else entirely, something darker and more complex, tied to his own untold past? The mystery of him was as profound as her own desolation, a shadow that moved beside her in the deepening night. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence between them punctuated only by the crunch of their footsteps and the whisper of the wind, carrying the faint, distant howls of unseen creatures. Each step was a step away from her past, a hesitant journey into an utterly unknown future. The camp emerged from the shadows like a collection of phantom limbs, a cluster of rough canvas tents and makeshift shelters huddled low to the ground. A faint flickering light emanated from one of the structures, a beacon in the vast darkness. The air here was heavy with the smells of wood smoke, damp earth, and unwashed bodies, a stark and raw scent that spoke of hard lives lived on the margins. As they approached, the sound of low voices, rough and indistinct, reached her ears. Kyle led her towards the largest of the tents, his grip still firm, a silent signal that she was under his temporary protection. Inside, the light flickered from a small, sputtering oil lamp, casting dancing shadows on the grimy canvas walls. A few men sat hunched over a crude table, their faces grim and weary, their clothes indistinguishable from Kyle's own. They were railroad men, laborers, their lives etched with the brutal demands of the iron road. Their eyes, bleary and suspicious, turned towards her as Cale entered, their gazes lingering on her small, dirty figure, with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. She felt their judgment like a physical weight, a silent accusation of her presence, of her unexpected intrusion into their hardened world. These were the stereotypical societal figures, their faces mirroring the weary cynicism of a world that had little patience for the vulnerable. One man, burly and unshaven, grunted, his voice thick with a guttural dialect she didn't understand. His eyes, cold and assessing, seemed to strip away her meager defenses. Kyle merely nodded, a curt acknowledgement of their presence, and led her to a corner, away from their scrutinizing gazes. He gestured towards a rough blanket spread over a pile of straw. "Rest," he commanded, his voice as low and flat as the plains outside. It was not an offer, but an instruction, clear and absolute. He did not ask if she was hungry again, or if she was cold, merely provided the means for basic survival. She sank onto the straw, the rough texture a welcome relief after the unforgiving gravel. The blanket, thin and scratchy, offered meager warmth, but it was warmth nonetheless. The men continued their hushed conversation, their words a low murmur that occasionally rose to a sharp, angry tone. She understood none of it, yet the tension in the air was palpable, a current of unease running through the small tent. This was a place of survival, not comfort, a temporary haven fraught with unspoken dangers and the ever-present threat of a world that wanted little to do with outcasts. Kyle sat down near the entrance, his back to her, a sentinel guarding the fragile peace of the night. Sleep did not come easily. The foreign sounds of the camp, the snores of the men, the rustle of the canvas, the distant hoot of an owl, created a symphony of unease. Her body ached, a deep, pervasive weariness that settled into her bones. Every now and then she would hear Cale shift, a quiet movement that reassured her he was still there, a silent anchor in the turbulent sea of her fear. She drifted in and out of consciousness, snippets of memory flickering like faulty lamps in the darkness. A warm kitchen, the scent of fresh bread, her mother's gentle humming, a hand-carved wooden bird, her father's patient smile as he showed her how to make it fly. These were ghosts, beautiful and heartbreaking, tormenting her with what was lost. A sudden, sharp voice cut through the stillness, jolting her awake. It was the burly man from earlier, his words now laced with a simmering anger. Though she couldn't grasp the specifics, the tone was clear, accusatory. Cale's response was a low growl, a terse, almost indistinguishable retort, but it carried a weight of defiance. The tension in the tent thickened, a heavy shroud. It seemed Cale's decision to bring her here was not universally accepted. The men, their faces etched with the harsh realities of their lives, perhaps saw her as another burden, another mouth to feed, another vulnerability in a world that demanded strength. She understood in a primal sense that her presence was a source of conflict, a disruption to their precarious existence. Her breathing became shallow, her small body tensing, ready to flee, though to where, she knew not. The air crackled with unspoken threats, the metallic tang of resentment. Was this the cost of his reluctant aid? Would she become a pawn in their internal struggles? The locket on Kyle's chest, hidden now by the folds of his shirt, seemed to mock her, a symbol of a tenderness he guarded even from his own kind. She desperately wanted to know its story, to understand the man who, despite the clear disapproval of his peers, had taken her in. The very act of his protection, flawed and unsentimental as it was, carried with it a profound, almost tragic irony. He, a figure on the fringes of society, now offered her an even greater outcast, a fragile, temporary refuge. Yet his actions created a new kind of tension, a new set of risks. The slow burn pacing of her survival was marked by these small, escalating conflicts, each one a subtle tightening of the narrative noose. The argument, though hushed, continued its relentless cadence, like a distant storm threatening to break. The burly man's voice rose, sharp and guttural, punctuating his words with dismissive gestures towards her corner. Kyle's replies remained terse, clipped, offering no ground. The air was thick with their unspoken history, their shared hardships, and the sudden jarring imposition of her fragile existence. She understood enough from the venom in the burly man's tone to know he viewed her as a weakness, a drain, an unnecessary risk. This was the harsh reality of their world, a brutal mirror reflecting broader societal biases, where every mouth to feed was a burden, every act of compassion a luxury they could ill afford. She felt the weight of their collective judgment, the silent scorn of men hardened by a life of relentless toil and deprivation. They saw a liability, not a child. The irony was palpable. She, an orphan, now clung to the very people society had cast aside, men who themselves were figures of the fringes, their lives as transient and unrooted as the tracks they laid. The locket, a symbol of a different, perhaps softer past, remained hidden beneath Cale's shirt, an enigma against his stoic front. This conflict, internal to the camp, was a harsh echo of the larger conflict she had fled, a constant reminder that her vulnerability was a perpetual target. Suddenly, Kyle's voice cut through the tension, louder this time, a sharp, decisive word that silenced the other man instantly. It was not a plea, but a command, an assertion of his will. The burly man grumbled, a low, defeated sound. Before turning his back, the argument seemingly resolved, at least for now. A fragile calm descended, but it was a brittle peace, easily shattered. The air still hummed with unresolved resentment. Kale, her reluctant protector, had chosen to defend her, not with words of sentiment, but with an unwavering, almost intimidating resolve. His morality was ambiguous, his methods blunt, but his choice, in that moment, was clear. She owed him her fragile existence, a debt she could not comprehend, let alone repay. Her fear, though momentarily quelled, was replaced by a profound unease. What was his motivation? What price would he exact for this unasked-for shelter? The answer remained shrouded in his silence, his weary eyes, and the hidden gleam of that silver locket, a constant nagging question that promised future revelations. The faint glow of dawn, a pale smear of gray on the eastern horizon, began to seep into the tent, chasing away the oppressive shadows of the night. The men stirred, their movements heavy and grudging, the air filling with the sounds of morning rituals, the clink of metal, the rustle of straw, the low grumbling of voices. Kyle rose, his form silhouetted against the canvas, and without a word, began to pack a small satchel with meager provisions. He moved with the practiced efficiency of one who had known countless dawns on the open land, his actions conveying a silent urgency. She watched him, her small body stiff from the cold and the discomfort of the hard ground, a flicker of apprehension stirring within her. Was this it? Was he leaving her here, to the mercy of these gruff, resentful men? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She clutched the thin blanket tighter, her eyes fixed on his every movement, desperate for a sign, a clue to his intentions. The mystery of him, the quiet strength that belied his rough exterior, became even more pronounced in the stark morning light. He finished packing, then turned, his gaze falling upon her. There was no pity, no warmth, but a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, perhaps a reluctant sense of responsibility, or a grim acknowledgement of their shared fate. "Come," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion, a simple directive. It was not an invitation, but an instruction, a summons to continue the journey. She scrambled to her feet, a profound sense of relief washing over her, quickly followed by the familiar anxiety of the unknown. She was still under his care for now. As she stood, her eyes once again caught the glint of the locket, still nestled against his skin. This time, as he moved, it shifted slightly, revealing a tiny, almost imperceptible engraving on its worn surface. It was a single stylized initial, barely visible, an M. The sight of it sent an unexpected jolt through her, a strange echo in her own nascent memories. An M. The letter lingered in her mind, a vague, half-formed image of a lullaby, a soft touch, a whispered name. It was a clue, small and seemingly insignificant, yet pregnant with untold stories, a hint at the profound emotional core he so carefully concealed. The shared initial, or perhaps the mere symbolism of a lost, beloved person, formed a subtle, unspoken connection between them, two disparate souls bound by loss and the unforgiving linearity of the rail lines. Kyle led her out of the tent, past the other men who merely offered grunts or averted their gazes, their resentment a palpable force in the morning air. The sun, a timid orange disk, began its slow ascent, casting long, distorted shadows across the desolate landscape. The air was crisp, carrying the metallic scent of damp earth and distant coal smoke. He didn't speak, simply set a steady pace, his long strides challenging her short, weary legs. She stumbled often, but he never let go of her hand, his grip a constant, unwavering presence. They walked away from the camp, away from the other railroad men, a clear separation, a choice he had made. The landscape unfolded around them, vast and empty, stretching to the horizon like an unwritten page. The rail lines, glinting in the burgeoning light, disappeared into the distance, a ribbon of steel leading to an unknown fate. As they walked, her mind drifted, pulled by the faint echo of the M on his locket. A fragmented image, like a discarded photograph, surfaced in her memory. A woman, her face obscured by shadow, her voice soft, singing, "My little bird, my sweet, sweet M." The words were not precise, more a feeling, a resonance. Could it be? Was it possible that the initial on Kyle's locket connected to her own past, to the mother she had lost? The thought was a wild, desperate hope, a fragile seed planted in the barren ground of her despair. She stole a glance at Cale's stern profile, searching for a hint, a confirmation, but his face remained a mask of stoicism. His journey, like hers, was shrouded in mystery. She recalled her father's last words, raspy and choked, as he pushed her from the train. Find the good in the M. He had been so desperate, so terrified, his words broken by the rattling of the train and the screams of others. For so long the instruction had been a meaningless jumble, a final, despairing utterance. But now, with the sight of Cale's locket, the pieces began to shift, to align in a terrifying yet strangely comforting way. The irony was almost unbearable. Her father, in his desperation, had perhaps pointed her towards a man who seemed outwardly hardened and morally ambiguous, yet carried a silent, almost sacred connection to her forgotten past. Was Cale the M her father had spoken of? Was he the one she was meant to find? The landscape seemed to hum with this revelation, the endless tracks now stretching not just forward, but backward, into the shrouded depths of her own memory, into the heart of a mystery that was finally, painstakingly beginning to unravel.